Okay, so in 40 minutes, I'm going to try and give you some sense of some of the arguments in the book. I can't cover all of them, but I want to give you some sense of what the book says. And usually when I talk, I don't talk about the legal issues that swirl around drone warfare, but I felt compelled, maybe at some risk to myself since I'm at a law school, to say something about the legal issues. So go easy on me. Okay, you've seen the cover of the book. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to say a little bit about how drone warfare works. Very briefly, why the US military likes drones so much. I'm going to talk about what I call the remixed battlefield. That's the way drones have changed the nature of warfare. Say something about the subjective experience of drone operators. There is, by the way, a controversy whether to call them pilots or operators. If you call them an operator, they don't like you so much, but I call them operators. There has been a protracted debate about the number of civilians that drones kill. And I want to go into some detail in that debate to try and help us look at it in a slightly different way. Then, as I promised, say something about the legal issues and something about what the future holds, all in 40 minutes. So off we go. Here's the thumbnail history of the drone. Does anyone know who that woman is in that picture? It is Marilyn Monroe. And in World War II, she worked in a drone factory before she was Marilyn Monroe. So she is holding the propeller. So drones were used in World War II for target practice, to practice shooting them down. And there was a brief ill-fated experiment with kamikaze drones. You would load a drone up with loads and loads and loads of high explosive. A pilot would take off in the drone and then parachute out and hand over the controls to people on the ground operating the drone remotely. And the idea was that you could then crash drones into Japanese ships and stuff like that. The problem was that many of the planes were unstable enough that they blew up before the pilot could parachute out. And one of those pilots who was killed that way, by the way, is JFK's older brother, killed in one of these drones. In the Vietnam War, a different kind of drone called the lightning bug was used. It was fired from under the wing of B-52s. It had cameras on the drone that would take pictures of the jungle to try and locate Viet Cong strongholds. They would either come back and drop by parachute, or they would be caught in the air, so that people could then go over the footage and use them to do surveillance of enemy territory. They were used in a similar way, but with the technology much more updated, during the wars in Yugoslavia, especially the Kosovo War in 1998. And at this point, the drones were being operated from the US. These were contemporary drones. The Predator drone was being used this way. They were not weaponized, so they couldn't kill anyone on the ground, but they could do intensive surveillance of the situation on the ground, identifying convoy supply routes, troop concentrations, potentially emergent massacres on the ground, and so on. And what made it possible to start to use drones in that way was suddenly there was an availability of bandwidth so that satellites could handle the bandwidth to send very high resolution camera footage back to control rooms in the US and in other parts of Europe to analyze. And GPS technology had been developed around this time as well. So although the drones themselves were not weaponized, they could laze on targets using GPS technology, and associated aircraft could come in and destroy those targets. One of the things that US military commanders liked about using Predators in this way is that until then they'd been using satellites. And unless the satellites were in geostationary orbit, they would only come over a particular target a couple of times a day. With the drone, when you found something you were interested in, you could circle it over and over and over again. If there was high cloud cover, you could get underneath the cloud cover that would obstruct the satellite's point of view. So the drones had real advantages over satellites for this kind of surveillance. The US resisted attempts to weaponize drones. The Israelis had been using drones in targeted assassinations, and the US had been condemning those, but changed its mind after the 9/11 attacks. So shortly after the 9/11 attacks, the US did an experiment in the Nevada desert, attacking a tank on the ground with a Hellfire missile, and that was the beginning of the contemporary weaponized drone. The first US drone strike was October 7th, 2001 in Afghanistan. Someone extraordinarily tall, who was thought to be Osama bin Laden, was the target. It turned out to be a case of mistaken identity, and a very tall peasant was killed. If you read the literature on drones, you get lots of different numbers about how many people it takes to operate a drone. So take this number of 170 with a pinch of salt. But the point I want to make here is it's easy to think of a drone as just operated by 2 or 3 people sitting in a trailer at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. But actually it takes far, far more people than that to operate a drone. First of all, there are 2 bases from which drones are flown. So although we think of drone operators in the US controlling the drone, the takeoffs and landings of drones are handled in regional Air Force bases near their area of operations. So for example, the US has had bases in Djibouti, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, building bases in Niger right now. Because of the 3-second time delay in communicating with a drone by satellite, when you're doing takeoffs and landings, you want someone to be able to control the drone by line of sight. So you have a local operator who's watching the drone in person, and then once the drone is stable and airborne, control of it is handed over to a remote operator somewhere in the United States. So what you see in the top left there is people loading weaponry onto a drone at a local Air Force base. You've got maintenance crews there that have to maintain the engines, put new weapons on and so on. You see the drone taking off from that local regional base. And then the bottom right is the trailer from which you've got one person steering the drone and someone else operating sensors. And on the bottom left, you see this sort of control room where drone footage is being piped in to intelligence analysts. Countries the US has attacked with drones. So you may wonder why there's a line in the middle of this, this chart. What distinguishes Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria from the countries below the line? In the book, I argue that there are actually 2 distinct kinds of drone warfare. One of them I call mixed drone warfare, and it's not what we associate with drone warfare, but it is actually the most common way in which drones are used. So a mixed drone warfare, which is what we see in Afghanistan and Syria today, and the way drones were being used in Iraq, you have US drones being used in concert with ground troops and in concert with other kinds of air power, like Apache helicopters, Warthogs, F-16s. So drones are just one part of the mix. And I don't know what the updated statistic is, but when I published this book, 75% of all drone strikes were actually in Afghanistan. So it was in this kind of a context where they were lending support to ground troops, and they were attacking insurgents on the ground as part of this sort of wider war with all sorts of different forces in play. Now, what is below the line are countries where the US has practiced what in the book I call pure drone warfare. Pure drone warfare means it's a country with which the US is not formally at war. It does not deploy other kinds of air assets to attack people in that country. In some cases, special forces may be on the ground, but there's not a large presence of US ground troops. And so pretty much the extent of US attacks on targets in these countries is drone strikes. That's all it is, drone strikes. And they have taken place in Yemen, in Somalia, Libya, the Philippines. The Philippines may surprise you, but the US has done 2 drone strikes attacking Muslim insurgent training camps in the Philippines. Pakistan, the small corner of Pakistan, Waziristan, country the size of the Bahamas, with a population of under 1 million. The US has done, that we know of, 400 drone strikes on Waziristan. In 2011, the US was doing 1 drone strike every 3 days in Waziristan. There are rumors, and I put question marks here because I'm not sure if the rumors are true, but there are rumors that the US has attacked Mali, targets in Mali, in Northwest Africa. And if it hasn't attacked targets in Niger, it's believed that it soon will. I was doing a little more reading today, and I read that under President Trump, the tempo of drone strikes has increased by 5 times compared to the last year of the Obama administration. It's interesting, the media have lost interest in drones. So we don't really think that drone strikes are happening, right? But apparently they're happening 5 times as often as they were in the last year of the Obama administration. This is the workhorse of the drone fleet, the Reaper. The predecessor to this was the Predator, which has now been retired. This gives you some of the vital statistics. It gives you some sense of the endurance of a Reaper drone, just how long it can stay up there in the air. And the military love the fact that it can be up there for 24 hours or more and can really follow insurgents as they move around. If they're passing off weapons to other insurgents, it can track those patterns, can see where insurgents go and sleep at night, what they do in the daytime. So it can gather a lot of intelligence by being up there in the air and able to follow things around. The Predator was only able to use one kind of missile, the Hellfire, but the Reaper can use lots of different kinds of weapons, so it can be more discriminate in targeting things on the ground. It is said that a Reaper can, with one of these very small ordnance weapons, a smart, small weapon, it can destroy one room in a house and leave the rest of the house intact. So why does the military like drones? First of all, as I just mentioned, there's this capability for persistent, flexible surveillance. You can stay up there in the air a long time looking at things that interest you, and you can move the drone around, unlike a satellite. There's also cost. It's pretty cheap. Predator was $4.5 million. 50% of the Predators the US built crashed, but even so, they were a pretty good deal. The Reaper is more expensive at $22 million, but half of what an F-16 costs, and a fraction of what an F-35, the latest fighter bomber, will cost. There's the precision of a drone, the ability to laze on a target, destroy a target down to like a few feet, and to wait until someone is no longer around civilians. So, for example, drone pilots are instructed where possible, if they're tracking, say, insurgents in Yemen, to wait until they're in a car and they're out in the open road and attack them there rather than in a city. And then finally, General David Deptula, who's like the Pentagon high priest of drones, has said that drones allow you to project power without projecting vulnerability. What that means in plainer English is only the other side dies. If your drone crashes, there's no American pilot in it to die. No Americans come home in body bags. As we all know, opinion turned against both the Vietnam and the Iraq wars as more and more American military personnel came home in body bags. The drone is one answer to this, where only the other side dies. And you can see that the drones have strong support in public opinion. When this opinion poll was done in 2015, almost 60% of Americans approved of drone warfare. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of remixing the battlefield, reconfiguring the battlefield, ways in which drones have changed the subjective experience and the objective practice of warfare. So first of all, they've changed the route paradigm of war from the duel to the hunt. This is not my idea. Grégoire Chamaillou, a French social theorist who wrote a book, Theory of the Drone, says, and I'm quoting here, contrary to Carl von Clausewitz's classical definition, the fundamental structure of this type of warfare is no longer that of a duel, of two fighters facing each other. The paradigm is quite different, a hunter advancing on a prey that flees or hides from him. So it's sort of like, it's somewhere between combat and execution or assassination or police law enforcement, but it's not what we associate with classical warfare, where you have warriors facing off against each other, wagering their lives on a cause that they believe in or a cause they've been conscripted to fight for. One of the consequences of this is a debate within the military about the degree to which one can talk about drone operators as having been in combat. There was an interesting episode during the Obama administration where the Pentagon introduced a medal especially for drone operators. And there was such uproar within the Pentagon that the medal was then withdrawn within a month or so. And in the book, I quote some people in the military who are not drone operators, who make very derisive comments about the chair force and about people getting Purple Hearts for paper cuts and for carpal tunnel syndrome and things like that. And this goes along with this shift in the route paradigm of warfare from the duel to the hunt. The battlefield is also remixed geographically, right? You have people in Nevada killing people on the other side of the world in countries with whom the US is not formally at war, right? It seems that the whole planet has become a battlefield. And Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump have all publicly declared that the US reserves the right to go after Al-Qaeda and its allies wherever it finds them, right? So the world of the Geneva Conventions, our idealized old-fashioned image of the world of warfare, is that there's a clearly demarcated battlefield, and people in that battlefield can be killed. People outside that battlefield might be killable in some situations, but they're presumed to be non-combatants, right? The classical version of this would be 18th or 19th century European warfare. And that has eroded through the 20th century, and I think that process of erosion has reached its endpoint, if you like, with drone warfare, where you now have this globalized battlefield where someone who is considered a potential enemy of the US can be killed all over the planet. And it does raise a very interesting question, which I've asked undergraduates from time to time in my anthropology of war class. And the question is this: if the Taliban or Al-Qaeda could somehow get a team to Nevada, close to Creech Air Force Base, is it okay for them to kill a drone operator as he drives home to dinner with his family on I-25? I mean, it would be the low-tech equivalent of what a drone does in Yemen or Somalia or Waziristan. When I ask students this, they look uncomfortable. Some of you are looking a little uncomfortable. And the majority of them say, well, yeah, I guess that would be okay. And then I say, okay, well, what if they wait till the guy gets home and he's having dinner with his family? What if they kill him with his family? Which drone operators do quite often. They kill insurgents with their wives and their children. Call that collateral damage. And the number of people who think that's okay then goes down quite considerably. But it does raise these very interesting questions of symmetry. If it's okay for us to hunt them, would it be okay for them to hunt us if they could get into the country to do that? And then finally, the third way in which the battlefield is remixed is that military combat killing becomes shift work. Our old notion of being in the military and being in combat is that you are deployed to a military base. On that military base, you are separated from your family. You are in the company only of fellow warriors, and you all experience solidarity together, and you go into combat together. The new model for drone operators is very much like factory shift work. And a typical workload for a drone operator is 6 12-hour shifts a week. So you leave your family, you drive to work, you go into a trailer, you follow people around virtually, sometimes you kill them, then you drive home and you have dinner with your family. And then you get up the next day and you do it all over again. So one drone operator says, and I quote, "You've been on a combat mission and half an hour later, your spouse is mad at you because you're late to soccer practice. Friction at home can stem from just that simple question on walking through the door. How was your day?" So a lot of drone operators experience the transition, this oscillation between intimate family life and the virtual battlefield inside the trailer as being very difficult to navigate psychologically. So there's a whole new psychological subjective experience of warfare that comes along with this respatialization that drones are affecting. Now, a number of critics of drone warfare have argued that drone operators are callous, indifferent people who see the people they kill as just little blips on a screen. They kill without conscience because it's just so abstract to them. So Jeff Sluka, another anthropologist who writes about drones, says to the drone pilot, it's like pushing Control-Alt-Delete and the target dies. The International Committee of the Red Cross said, advanced technologies which permit killing at a distance or on the computer screen prevent the activation of neuropsychological mechanisms which render the act of killing difficult. So in other words, it's really easy to kill people when they're on the other side of the world. You're disinhibited, it's abstract, you're distanced. You can do it without feeling remorse or much pain of any kind. I think that this set of arguments is absolutely wrong. And so in the book, I coined this term remote intimacy, where I argue that you're 8,000 miles away and simultaneously 15 inches away from the people that you are tracking and killing. Here's a quote from a recent New York Times Magazine article that some of you may have read called The Wounds of the Drone Warriors. Drone operator said, "It's still weird taking another life. Distance brings it through a screen, but it's still happening, and it's happening because of you," right? And one thing I think that the critics of drone warfare don't appreciate when they surmise how easy it must be to kill people by drone is what goes into killing someone in that way. So a drone operator might track someone for 8 hours before killing them, even for several days. So drone operators will talk about tracking an insurgent, seeing them with their wife and with their kids, getting a sense that they might be a loving father, and knowing all the time they're watching them doing this, that eventually they're going to destroy them, dismember them from the sky. So if you're a drone operator, you develop narratives about these people, right? What kind of people they are. You feel like you know them a little bit. Then you blow them apart, and you don't just leave when you blow them apart. The drone operators are required to circle, maybe for as long as 4 hours, to count the body parts, to provide an after-action report of how many people have been killed, whether any of them were women and children, right, or whether they were all insurgents. So if you're an F-16 pilot, you drop your bomb and you're gone. You don't see what you did. If you're a drone pilot, you're circling and you're constantly looking at how people are reacting to what you did. You may see women wailing. The next day, you may watch the funeral. And you're looking at those body parts. So I want to show you an interview with a drone operator who talks about the experience of killing in this way. So just a couple of things about that. He's operating a drone at night, so the camera is infrared. It's picking up body heat. So when he talks about seeing the person change color, with an infrared color, if someone's alive, they're very red and vital. And then as they die, they become gray. And when he talks about the person becoming the color of the earth, he's talking about losing his heat as he dies and turning from red to gray. It's a different way of watching someone die than if you've shot someone and they're right in front of you, or you've bayoneted them or something. But I hope you get some sense from his testimony of how very vivid that is for him. It's not abstract at all. And you hear from his testimony that he really feels the person's pain. He says that he could sort of see him writhing in agony, even though he's thousands of miles away. And the other thing I would just note at the end is the hesitation when he tries to decide who it was who killed this person. He's conflicted between we and I, right? And drone warfare is set up in this way with a distributed network of decision-making so that it can be hard to know where your responsibility begins and ends in this network of decision-makers. So one other thing I will say about this issue before moving on to talk about civilian casualties is that it's now becoming clearer that there are quite high rates of PTSD among drone operators. At first, 4 or 5 years ago, the military tried to deny it, but it's now becoming clearer and clearer. And if you read the New York Times Magazine article, the evidence there was pretty clear. The military has tried to say that it's stress that's caused by operational tempo, the fact that these people work 6 12-hour shifts a week because there's a shortage of drone operators. But it's looking more and more as if this particular experience of killing people is one that is subjectively quite stressful for people. And drone operators are reporting having nightmares, finding it difficult to concentrate, finding images that are haunting them, the classic symptoms of PTSD. Okay, so let's talk about civilian casualties. American leaders, especially under the Obama administration, like to boast that drone warfare was the most moral kind of warfare imaginable because of the precision with which it could be waged. So John Brennan, who we've been hearing about recently, the CIA director, said there hadn't been a single civilian death because of the exceptional precision of drones. And President Obama himself said before any strike is taken, there must be near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured, the highest standard we can set. I'm just talking about the drone campaign in Waziristan here. A number of different organizations have tried to estimate how many civilians were in fact killed in that drone warfare campaign up to 2013. The Long War Journal is a journal that's attached to the Marine Corps They have the lowest estimate, but they still concede that almost 200 civilians were killed in Pakistan. We don't really know much about their methodology for coming up with those numbers. The New America Foundation has a higher estimate. They have a methodology where 2 independent news sources have to confirm a civilian death before they'll count it. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism is an NGO in London that has an anti-drone slant, but is still widely thought to do intense investigations that are quite rigorous. And they not only use Western and Pakistani media sources, but they also use eyewitness testimony from the ground. And they have a higher count that goes up to almost 1,000 at the high end. They give a range. But anyway, it's clear that substantial numbers of civilians have, in fact, been killed in drone warfare, despite what John Brennan and President Obama said. So this is just another way of representing that data. It shows the stark difference in estimates. I want to caution you before asking how these civilians have been killed about problems in accurately estimating civilian deaths. A place like Waziristan, the Pakistani military has it fenced off. They won't let you in there. So there's a reliance on remote witnessing of one kind or another. The drone operators do their own casualty estimates. That's one kind of remote witnessing. Or human rights activists rely on people coming out of the zone and they interview them. That's another kind of remote witnessing. It's hard to know who is a combatant and who isn't because Al-Qaeda people don't have an Al-Qaeda uniform. They look just like civilians. The US has developed a default counting algorithm where if they're between 16 and about 65 and they're male, they are assumed to be an insurgent. I presume you don't need me to point out the problem with that as a counting rule, right? And then there's the question, what is an insurgent? You know, we speak about insurgents and non-combatants as if there's a clear distinction between the two. But thanks to reports from anthropologists on the ground and journalists, we now know that low-level insurgents are very fungible. People will move in and out of the insurgency. They need money. The insurgents offer them $200 to plant an IED. They'll go and do it. Doesn't mean they really wanted to do it, but they need $200. Their clan leader decides to make an alliance with someone. So this week, they're with the insurgents. Maybe next month, they won't be. So just this question of who is an insurgent and who is a non-combatant can be very problematic. If an insurgent leader has a cook, is the cook also a combatant? If he has a driver, is the driver a combatant, right? So in the book, I claim that under the Obama administration in particular, there was a process of what I call ethical slippage, where the rules of engagement around drone strikes were relaxed. The Obama administration found that the Al-Qaeda threat was growing and it was metastasizing to countries like Yemen and Somalia. And when it attacked Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, they'd flee across the border to Pakistan. And the US couldn't give chase to them with ground forces and go into Pakistan because it wasn't at war in Pakistan. So it started to attack them with drones in Pakistan. And it started to be more and more aggressive about attacking them because they were losing the counterinsurgency battle. It's very easy to be moral and ethical as a warfighter when you're winning. The real test of your ethics comes when you're losing, right? And the Obama administration, I would argue, failed that test. As it was losing, it started to relax the rules of engagement. So Brennan and Obama said that they only attacked people with drones when they had confirmation that this was the person they were looking for. These are what are called personality strikes, where you have a known personality who's an insurgent leader. You're looking for that known personality, and if you find them, you kill them with a drone. Now, these people don't wave at the drone and say, "Hi, I'm here," and facial recognition and camera resolution are not strong enough to be able to recognize someone's face from a drone. So in practice, you're piecing together shards of intelligence that lead you to believe that that guy down there right now is the person that you want to kill. And there have been some clear mistakes. The NGO Reprieve issued this report, You Never Die Twice. They did a very simple, elegant piece of research. They read all the newspaper accounts where the US had said, "We killed so-and-so, and we're proud that we killed him with a drone." And they made a huge master list of all the people that in its press releases the Pentagon said it had killed. and it found that 41 people had been killed 3 times, which suggests that 2 of those times someone else was killed, not them, right? And to me, it's amazing that the Pentagon wasn't careful enough before saying they were killed the 2nd and 3rd time to see if they'd already claimed that they were dead. And thanks to some enterprising reporting from Der Spiegel, we also know that one of the main ways of targeting people is to go after their cell phones. So the drones are constantly tracking cell phone traffic on the ground. And if they hear an insurgent on a cell phone, they say, okay, this insurgent is connected with this SIM card and this number. Next time we come across that SIM card, we're going to kill the person holding that phone. Now, what if you don't come across that SIM card for 3 or 4 months, right? Are you sure that the SIM card is still in the phone and still in the hands of the insurgent leader it was in the first time you caught it? Turns out that German and American commanders had a fundamental disagreement about that. So in parts of Afghanistan that were under German air traffic control, there were far fewer drone strikes than in parts under American control, because the Germans wanted in real-time contemporaneous confirmation that they knew the person who was holding that phone. Whereas under Obama, the American controllers relaxed those requirements, and they were going after these phones on the supposition that they belonged to a person they knew, but were sometimes wrong. We also know that in Waziristan, the CIA was paying up to 5,000 times a pop to informants on the ground to identify insurgent leaders that they want. Akbar Ahmed, an anthropologist, Pakistani anthropologist, has written that it's clear that in a number of cases in Waziristan, these informants sort of gamed the system. Imagine you're a farmer, you're in a feud with the farmer next door, you think that their land belongs to you, and if you tell the CIA that they're an insurgent leader, you get their land and you get a bonus payment of $5,000, which is worth an awful lot more in Waziristan than it is here. So you can see the problems that this sets up. Colin Powell's former assistant, Lawrence Wilkerson in particular, has been very critical of this practice. Now, I've spoken as if the drones are only doing personality strikes, going after named people that can be identified. But we found out a few years ago that actually the majority of drone strikes are what are called signature strikes. It's a little bit like racial profiling. You have no idea who the people are. They're doing things on the ground that look suspicious. They're digging, so you think maybe they're burying an IED, and you go after them for that reason. It turns out that you can make some serious mistakes if you go after people based on behavioral profiling. Much of the time, the behavioral profiling is pretty self-evident. If people are shooting at American troops, it's pretty clear that they're the enemy, and you can go after them. But the LA Times managed to FOIA the entire transcript of a drone strike a few years ago in Afghanistan, where drones were watching over a platoon of Marines, and they had a tip that the Taliban were going to attack this platoon. And they saw a convoy of pickup trucks traveling through the night, signaling at each other with their lights. They were flashing their headlights at each other, and they thought that that looked like the kind of thing the Taliban would do. And then at dawn, the convoy stopped and everyone got out. They took out their prayer mats and they prayed. And in the transcript, you see the drone operators saying, oh, well, that clinches it. You know, you can see these are religious fanatics. These are our people. Well, no, it was a convoy of families taking their children to school and going to market at a nearby town. The drone strike killed over a dozen children and a number of women as well. So behavioral profiling can create problems like that, as we know from domestic policing, right? Why so many African Americans have been shot dead by the police. Okay, I promised I would say something about legal issues. I do want to say that it's remarkable to me the institutions in American society that have had so little to say about drone warfare. The courts have had little to say about it. The churches, Congress has only held 2 congressional hearings that I'm aware of. I'm going to stick my neck out and say law schools have not been tremendously interested, with the exception of NYU's law school, which issued an excellent report on drone warfare. The critiques of many come from NGOs, UN special rapporteurs, human rights activists, and so on. This is a picture of Anwar al-Awlaki. There's absolutely no doubt that he was affiliated with al-Qaeda. He was a US citizen. He was living in Yemen. He was killed by a drone strike. His parents, knowing that he was on the target list, had petitioned a US court for his right to see the evidence against him and to say that he had the right not to be killed. The court refused to hear his case. So he was executed, an American citizen, without the benefit of a trial. We can argue the merits of whether that was okay or not. Some other issues. The War Powers Act. The White House has never invoked the War Powers Act. Harold Koh, former dean of the law school at Yale, said the limited nature of this kind of mission is not the kind of hostilities envisioned by the War Powers Act. You know, we just occasionally attack a country with a drone. That's really not the kind of thing that the War Powers Act was set up to deal with. Though in other contexts, in the UN, Harold Koh and the Obama administration were arguing that this was a kind of war, so they're kind of having it both ways. Jack Goldsmith, former senior lawyer in the Bush administration, said, the administration's theory implies that the president can wage war with drones and all manner of offshore missiles without having to bother with the War Powers Resolution's time limits. So two lawyers disagreeing about whether the War Powers Act applies. The authorization to use military force in 2001 is regularly invoked by the Pentagon to explain why there is authorization under domestic law for drone strikes. This is the full quote. Authorizing the military to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he, that's the president, determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. I have a hard time reading prose written by some lawyers. It needs more punctuation, I think. So the US military still says that that authorizes them to do drone attacks in Somalia, in Yemen, or wherever. Now, it's an interesting question. The people who wrote that, did they imagine that they were authorizing attacks in Libya, where al-Qaeda had no presence in the aftermath of Gaddafi being overthrown? And what about attacks on ISIS? The terrorist attack of September 11th was done by al-Qaeda. ISIS is the enemy of al-Qaeda. There's no way that you can say ISIS is associated with al-Qaeda. They're sworn enemies. So does the wording of this resolution authorize attacks on ISIS as well? Then there's international law. So the Obama administration, in a memo written by Harold Koh, claimed that there were two justifications under international law for drone strikes. One was that the countries where the drone strikes were being executed had quietly given consent. So let's talk about that for Pakistan. It's clear that the president of Pakistan had given consent, though once the US said this publicly, he withdrew consent because it embarrassed him. But the legislature had publicly voted against authorizing the drone strikes. So the consent there is very murky. Their Congress has said, no, there isn't consent. Their president has said, well, there's consent, but don't tell anyone I said there's consent. Is that consent? Is that clear consent under international law? And then there's imminent threat. So you're allowed to use military force without going to an international body like the UN for permission in the case of an imminent threat. And I understand that the case law on this goes back to the 1842 Carolina case. It says the threat must be instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment of deliberation. So you look over the hill and you see enemy forces massing, it's clear they're going to attack. You have to do something to protect yourself. You don't have much time. That does not really describe the situation of drone warfare, where the US is meticulously hunting down people. Harold Koh said the US government may not be aware of all al-Qaeda plots as they're developing, and thus cannot be confident that none is about to occur. So in other words, the threat is always imminent. You don't know those unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know. So you have to assume that the threat is always imminent. Rosa Brooks, law professor at Georgetown, says from a rule of law perspective, this is a radical assault on a once stable concept. If imminent threat can mean lack of evidence of the absence of imminent threat, it's impossible to know with any clarity the circumstances under which the United States will decide that the use of military force is lawful. So in other words, the US has turned this concept of imminent threat into scrambled eggs. Okay, so I think I'm at the end of my time here. Some closing thoughts. First, can counterinsurgency succeed purely through targeted killing from the air? I don't think so. There's now abundant evidence that especially when the drones kill innocent civilians, they recruit as many insurgents as they kill. And in order to win a counterinsurgency war, you need to control territory on the ground, you need to win hearts and minds. The US has tried to fight counterinsurgency on the cheap by not having US troops in harm's way, but it's a fool's errand. It is not the way that a counterinsurgency war can be won. Second closing thought I want to leave you with is that drones create a state of low-level permanent war. They have now so scrambled the distinction between peace and war that they've created this sort of endemic, episodic, permanent state of warfare between the US and some parts of the world, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. And then thirdly, there's the issue of moral hazard. I don't know if you're familiar with Immanuel Kant's concept of moral hazard. I'll give you an example of moral hazard from what my teenage son would like to be the case in my family. He wants me to buy him a car, and he wants an agreement that if he crashes the car, I'll buy him another one, and I'll pay for the insurance. That's moral hazard because he has no incentive to drive carefully. I bear all the costs, not him, right? He's not getting it. But drone warfare is like that, right? Because the Americans don't come back in body bags. The American public isn't interested. Congress isn't interested. The churches aren't interested. So it's very, very tempting. It's a cheap mode of warfare. You can say you're doing something about Al-Qaeda on the other side of the world. And it's only those people over there who bear the cost when they lose family members and so on. So I think there's a real moral hazard to the American body politic here. And then a few questions about the future. How will warfare change as drones proliferate? ISIS is already using crude tactical drones. And I think in the future, we can imagine many more nations with drones. The Pentagon is trying to create micro drones that will be much less easy to detect. Smart, autonomous, artificial intelligence drones are the new frontier for the military. So you program the drones so that they decide who's a combatant and who's a non-combatant. There's no human in the loop. That is now the ambition of David Deptula and other people in the Air Force. So the question is, if one of these smart autonomous drones kills civilians, who is responsible for that war crime? Do you say the drone was responsible and destroy it? Where does responsibility lie? I'm also concerned that American police forces are acquiring drones for domestic surveillance use, and I wonder how long it will be before they weaponize those drones in some emergency situation, so that drones can then be used to kill American citizens on American territory from the air. And we have to be deeply concerned, I think, about the threat of terrorist drones. For $500, you can walk into Best Buy, buy a really excellent drone that you could put a handgun on, a machine gun on, a crude chemical weapon, a hand grenade, something like that. You could fly it into a shopping mall. You could fly it into a baseball game. The airport I'm flying into later today, DCA, has this huge swath of grass just by the runway where people are encouraged to hang out and picnic and play ball and so on. It'd be very easy to bring a civilian jetliner down with a Best Buy drone from on that piece of grass if you wanted to. So I think these are some of the things that we should be concerned about for the future. And I'll be happy to take any questions and argue with any of your critiques in the time left.